In terms of ICE, I've been in cells just like this. There was about 30 of us crammed in a place no bigger than this.
Paul Sok says he was once detained with 30 other immigrants in a cell like this in California by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE.
And we were just left there, and we were trying to find out where we were going, where we were being taken. They didn't tell us anything. They were actually being really disrespectful, really rude, telling us to kind of just shut up.
Nearly 100 immigrant detainees have died in ICE detention centers in the last decade. The U.S. government has reported that in the majority of those deaths, ICE violated its own internal medical care standards, guaranteed under federal law. We've emailed ICE about the treatment of immigrants in its detention centers. Our repeated requests for an interview have gone unanswered. We recently filmed some of the thousands of immigrants who have been detained after crossing into the U.S. from Mexico. According to the U.S. government, there are 200 of these facilities around the country. The majority of them are operated by private, for-profit prison corporations paid with U.S. taxpayer dollars. Private, for-profit prisons that earn several $billions annually. Historically, private prisons in the U.S., such as the GEO Group and Core Civic, formerly known as CCA, started operating in the 1980s to relieve overpopulated public prisons in the United States. The U.S. incarcerates more people than any country on earth. More than 2 million people are presently behind bars. And then in recent years, the U.S. government began paying private prison companies to house hundreds of thousands of immigrants flooding into the U.S. from Mexico, many fleeing violence in Mexico and Central America.
ICE agents, come into the buildings and just tell people and yell and scream at them and just tell them to F off. I'm going to make sure you go back to your country.
As a former immigrant detainee, Paul Sok says he saw firsthand how private prisons in the U.S. keep the public in the dark about the treatment of immigrants in these facilities. Sok says during his time inside ICE detention facilities, he's witnessed complaints filed by detainees destroyed.
I've seen complaints get ripped up.
And he says detainees who've complained have been removed from the premises.
People just kind of disappear.
Paul Sok isn't just some random former ICE detainee blowing the whistle on abuse in private prisons. Paul Sok has been honored for doing so on this mural at the Los Angeles headquarters of the American Civil Liberties Union, called a hero in the fight for civil rights for immigrant detainees in the United States. Sok is today a noted organizer with the nonprofit Youth Justice Coalition in Los Angeles. Behind him is a large photo of what he says is one of the many people who've died while incarcerated in California.
Yeah, this kind of stuff right here, unfortunately, does happen inside of the carceral system.
Sok's extraordinary odyssey that would land him inside several private for-profit ICE detention facilities began decades earlier as a child who fled Cambodia as a refugee with his father during the U.S. war in neighboring Vietnam.
I am a product of American intervention in Southeast Asia because of, what was going on with the Vietnam War.
His father died from stomach cancer when Sok was 16. There was little support for him, he says, in the community. His school simply gave him a pamphlet on how to grieve.
And he passed away, and when I went looking for help, I couldn't find it. The only thing I got was a pamphlet on grief. A little brochure where, you flip it open, what is grief? And that was like the only thing I ever got as a kind of like a public social service support, and at the time I was essentially like the top student.
At 17, Sok says he went from being a top student in high school to committing armed robbery to survive. He was convicted and sentenced to 23 years in prison. When he was released after 17 years, he was immediately placed in ICE detention centers as an immigrant with a felony conviction, and he was scheduled to be deported. But then California Governor Jerry Brown pardoned Sok for his work advocating on behalf of young immigrants in need of a second chance. Today, Sok is on his way to becoming a U.S. citizen, and he's been advocating for the abolishment of private prisons ever since. In early 2021, U.S. President Joe Biden signed an executive order to end the use of private prisons.
And the Justice Department's use of private prisons, an industry that houses detainees and federal prisoners.
However, under Biden's order, private detention facilities for immigrants were still allowed to operate.
It's definitely not the greatest country on earth in that respect on how people are treated when they're just trying to find safety and well-being. You know, when you go into the immigration system, you're there indefinitely because you don't know when when there's no termination to it. It's just going to go on until you resolve it, however many years it takes. And I've met people that sat there for 5, 6, 7 years just trying to continue to fight however they can. I've met folks from Egypt, from Iran, from Honduras, from Guatemala, El Salvador. I've met people from Peru. I've met people from
Mexico.
I've met plenty of people from Mexico, different parts of Asia. Haven't really met too many people that were white.
What you 20 and also 1018.
Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon, whose office prosecutes more criminal cases than any other in the country, says the detention of immigrants in private prisons, while a federal matter, is clearly in need of reform. Gascon himself is an immigrant from Cuba.
I mean, look, I'm going to say what it sounds like a cliche. Our entire immigration system is broken, and I think both the right and the left agree. I think that, number one, there are economic forces that drive a lot of people to come to this country, and the economic forces work in both ends of the spectrum, right? They cannot survive in their own nation, where they came from.
And he says the private prison industry is clearly profiting from the thousands of immigrants fleeing into the U.S.
A huge economic interest, right? Almost anything in life you can follow the money trail, right? We have more prisons, private prisons. It's making a ton of money.
While he says his parents emigrated legally to the United States, he says undocumented immigrants deserve humane treatment when they arrive here.
And I give my parents a tremendous amount of credit. You know, I first of all, I grew up poor. I was not one of those rich Cubans. My parents were factory workers in Cuba. I grew up in a rough neighborhood in Havana, and I grew up in a rough neighborhood in Southeast LA here. But you know, my parents had a very strong sense of right and wrong, but they also had a very strong sense of fairness and justice. We have to create a path for people to regularize themselves. Number one, for those that are coming in that are valuable to our economy and our fabric of our society. And number two, for those that have already been here, you know, they have kids here, they have been here for generations, and we continue to drive them in sort of the shadows.
These jail cells Paul Soak shows us are actually inside the Youth Justice Coalition building here. That was once a courthouse facility in Los Angeles. He says visitors here, many of them students, often ask if all the stories they hear about detainees being abused in private prisons are true.
They're true. Physical abuse, I've seen cameras break suddenly when things go wrong and footage disappears. Stuff like that has happened. But you don't see those things because you don't have access to go see them, right? Because it's insulated inside of a concrete box where there's, blind spots, et cetera. It's all depressing. I think it's most depressing when folks are being basically denigrated. There's people of authority. The authority that's backing them is the U.S. government. Imagine you sitting there and you have nobody. You're just trying to, stay here with your family for whatever reasons you're here in the U.S. and your family is here and, you're just trying to maintain those family bonds. But here's this person that comes with the badge, with the authority of the United States against you, and you don't even have an attorney because you don't have the right to free legal counsel.
The mental trauma suffered inside of private prisons, he says, is often far worse than any kind of physical trauma.
There's trauma that's beyond, physical, of course. There's trauma that's mental, there's trauma that's emotional. And those things scar in ways that you can't see. Physical trauma, you can see. If you break a bone or something, you tend to leave scars in your body. Mental scars, you don't see those things. Emotional traumas and scars, you don't see those things. They're not tangible and physical. But I will say this. You cannot walk into a prison and be locked up for any period of time and walk out of there without having been touched some way psychologically or emotionally.
Damaged.
You're going to be damaged in some form or fashion somehow.
He says the children he's seen being detained are the ones who likely suffer the most.
You know, they're confused. They just don't know how to, they don't understand why they're in a jail. They don't understand why they're in a prison. You know, they don't understand why they're being treated that way. And they don't understand how to navigate the system. You know, it's very confusing. Imagine you're 6 or 7 years old, you come by yourself, for whatever reason you're here. Or maybe it's you and your siblings, and then you get here and then they separate you and your sibling and that's all you know. And then you're going to take him to go see a judge and there's like nobody there to help counsel you. You know, they're in a situation that I know pretty well.
Sok says since 1980, 22 prisons have been built in the state of California, compared to just 4 new university campuses. He says putting people in prisons, particularly immigrants in private detention cages, must end.
You know, we shouldn't be profiting off of people's struggles. We should be using taxpayer dollars to support communities so that there are no struggles. It's not cages. The supports that are needed are hospitals, after-school programming, parks, programs for young people to go to, libraries, functioning libraries, food banks. Those are the things that people need. They need jobs. You know, young people when they're out of school need work. They need to be able to feed for themselves, et cetera. Families and single mothers shouldn't have to work 2, 3 jobs just to get by.
The prisons are literally making billions.
And prisons are making billions. You know, that's crazy amounts of money. The private prison contracts, just for immigration detention, it was like $6 billion a year. And that's just for like the private prisons.
He asks the public to meet an immigrant sometime, rather than simply listening to what he calls the U.S. government's negative spin on immigrants.
Highly encourage folks in the community don't fall for fear-mongering, fear tactics. Don't listen to, you know, stuff that's easily insightful, inflammatory remarks, et cetera, because those things are of an interest designed to profit. I would ask people to not listen to the rhetoric that's out in the world. Actually get to know your community. Get to know people. And if you know people that are here that weren't born here, find out how they got here, why they got here, why they came here. If you know somebody that's been incarcerated, ask them why they ended up being incarcerated. Get to understand the societal conditions that brought people to the places that they're in, and have an understanding for those things and look for real solutions. Just think about people for people. Think about the needs that you've had in your own life and think about how we can provide those needs in the community. How can we meet those needs in the community everywhere? That's the simplest solution I can offer you. Because if you can meet those needs, people will have what they need to survive and thrive. We need our communities to thrive. There is nothing more cruel than to profit from folks' struggles and folks' miseries.